The UHMS Nightingale moved through the darkness of space like a white ghost against the black canvas of stars. The massive hospital ship was bigger than most military vessels in the sector, but it carried no weapons and no shields designed for combat. Its hull was painted pure white with red crosses visible from every angle. Anyone who looked at the vessel would know immediately what it was and what it represented. Peace, healing, and mercy in a galaxy that often forgot such things existed. Captain Daniel Hayes stood on the bridge and watched the stars drift past on the main viewing screen. He had commanded the Nightingale for 3 years now, and he still felt proud every time he looked at his ship. 2,047 people lived and worked on this vessel. Doctors, nurses, surgeons, medical technicians, and support staff from every corner of Earth. They had volunteered for this mission, knowing the dangers that came with operating in contested space. But they also knew that someone had to do this work. The ship's medical bay stretched across 4 entire decks in the central section of the vessel. Right now, those bays held patients from 6 different alien species. Some were soldiers caught in the crossfire of wars they did not start. Others were civilians who happened to be in the wrong place when violence erupted. The Nightingale did not ask questions about faction or allegiance. If someone needed medical help, the crew provided it without hesitation or judgment. Dr. Lisa Monroe worked in Surgery Bay 3 on the 2nd medical deck. She was focused entirely on the small patient lying on the table in front of her. The child was Vaxian, a species known for their blue skin and large eyes. This particular child was only 8 years old in human terms. A piece of shrapnel had torn through the child's abdomen during an attack on a refugee convoy. Lisa's hands moved with practiced precision as she repaired the damage. The child would live, and that was all that mattered to her in this moment. Nurse Emma Sullivan walked through the recovery ward and checked on each patient with care and attention. She had been with the Nightingale since it launched, and she could not imagine doing any other job. Every day brought new challenges and new opportunities to make a real difference. She stopped beside a Dalarian soldier who was recovering from burns he received when his ship was hit by plasma fire. The soldier looked up at her with gratitude in his eyes. Emma smiled and adjusted his medication levels to keep him comfortable. Commander Jake Peterson sat at the sensor station on the bridge and monitored the area around the ship. The Nightingale was currently in the neutral zone between Krellian and Xanthor territory. Both empires were at war with each other, and that made this region dangerous for any vessel. But the hospital ship broadcast its medical status on all frequencies in every known language. The red crosses on the hull were lit up bright enough to be seen from thousands of kilometers away. Every species in the galaxy recognized those symbols and knew what they meant. 3 new contacts appeared on Jake's sensor screen. He frowned and ran the signatures through the identification system. Krellian warships approaching fast from the direction of the asteroid field. Jake felt a small flutter of concern but pushed it aside. The Nightingale had encountered military vessels many times before, and there had never been any problems. Hospital ships were protected under 17 different galactic treaties. Attacking one was considered one of the worst crimes anyone could commit in civilized space. Jake opened a communication channel and transmitted the Nightingale's credentials on all standard frequencies. He included the ship's medical registry number, the names of the commanding officers, and the current patient manifest. Everything that proved beyond any doubt that this was a legitimate medical vessel operating under proper authority. The 3 Krellian ships continued their approach without responding to the transmission. Captain Hayes moved to stand beside Jake at the sensor station. He watched the 3 contacts growing closer and felt something cold settle in his stomach. The lead ship was a battlecruiser called the Severing Talon, according to the registry information. The other 2 were destroyers running escort formation. Still no response to their transmissions. Down in Surgery Bay 3, Lisa Monroe was closing the incision on her young patient when the alert sirens began to sound. She looked up in confusion. Those sirens were for emergency combat situations. But hospital ships did not face combat situations. That was the entire point of being a hospital ship. She returned her attention to her patient and finished the final sutures. Whatever was happening, this child needed her to complete the surgery properly. The first plasma bolt from the Severing Talon struck the Nightingale on the port side near the civilian quarters. The hull plating vaporized instantly, and the blast tore through 3 decks before the energy dissipated. 57 people died in that first hit, including everyone who was sleeping in the crew quarters on Deck 7. Captain Hayes barely had time to process what was happening before the second bolt struck the primary medical bay. The explosion ripped through the heart of the ship and killed everyone in Surgery Bay 3 instantly. Dr. Lisa Monroe never knew what hit her. One moment she was checking her patient's vital signs, and the next moment there was only fire and death. Emma Sullivan was thrown across the recovery ward when the shockwave hit. She slammed into a wall hard enough to crack 2 ribs. Alarms were screaming and the lights were flickering. She could hear her patients crying out in fear and pain. She tried to stand, but the ship lurched violently as a third plasma bolt struck the bridge section. Captain Hayes and everyone else on the bridge died in an instant. The Krellian vessels continued their attack with methodical precision. They targeted the engineering section next and then the secondary medical bays. The Nightingale had no weapons to fight back with, and no shield strong enough to withstand military-grade plasma fire. The ship was designed to save lives, not to survive combat. In less than 4 minutes, the vessel was torn apart. Emma managed to reach an escape pod with 6 other survivors. They launched just before the section they were in lost structural integrity. Through the pod's small window, Emma watched the Nightingale die. She watched the Krellian destroyers hunt down the other escape pods and destroy them one by one with precise weapons fire. She watched her home and her friends disappear in flashes of light and expanding debris clouds. The pod's emergency beacon activated automatically. Emma held the other survivors close as they drifted in the darkness and waited for rescue. 2,247 people had been on the Nightingale when the attack started. Now there were 7 witnesses to an atrocity that broke every rule of civilized warfare. A small trade vessel picked them up 6 hours later. The trader was horrified when he heard what happened and immediately set course for the nearest human outpost. Emma sat in the cargo hold and stared at nothing. She kept seeing Lisa's face in her mind. Lisa, who had been so focused on saving that Vaxian child. Lisa, who would never go home to her family now. The Krellian Empire transmitted a message to the Galactic Network explaining their actions. They claimed that human expansion into the sector had become a threat to their security. The destruction of the Nightingale was meant to serve as a warning to Earth. They expected humanity to respond with diplomatic protests and eventual negotiation. Every other species in the galaxy would have done exactly that. But the Krellians had made one critical error in judgment. They did not understand humanity at all. They did not understand what happened when you attacked people who could not fight back. They did not understand the rage that would follow this act. And they definitely did not understand that Earth had been preparing for exactly this kind of situation for a very long time. The message from Emma Sullivan's pod reached Earth exactly 26 hours after the attack. The recording included clear footage of the Nightingale's destruction and the systematic hunting of escape pods. That footage was about to change everything. The Krellian Empire had roughly 72 hours left before they learned the hardest lesson of their entire civilization. You do not attack human medical personnel, not ever. Admiral Christina Blake sat in her office at Earth Defense Command headquarters and watched the footage for the 3rd time. The holographic display showed everything in terrible detail. The Nightingale floating peacefully in space with its medical symbols bright and clear. The 3 Krellian warships approaching without warning. The first plasma bolt tearing into the hull. The systematic destruction that followed. The hunting of escape pods like they were nothing more than practice targets. Christina had served in Earth's military for 32 years. She had seen combat during the colony wars, and she had witnessed death in many forms. But this was different. This was not combat. This was murder. She watched the recording again and felt something cold and hard settling in her chest. The Krellians had just crossed a line that should never be crossed. The emergency call went out within an hour of receiving Emma Sullivan's transmission. President Marcus Webb convened the United Earth Council in emergency session. Representatives from every major nation and colony gathered in the council chamber. The room was normally filled with debate and discussion, and the usual political noise that came with governing billions of people spread across dozens of worlds. Today there was only silence. The footage played on the main screen for everyone to see. 2,247 names scrolled past as the ships burned. Doctors and nurses and medical technicians who had volunteered to help anyone who needed it. People who had taken an oath to heal and to do no harm. People who had believed that their mission would protect them from violence. When the footage ended, nobody spoke for a full minute. President Webb stood at the podium and looked out at the assembled representatives. He did not need to say much. Everyone in the room understood what this meant. Everyone knew that humanity's response would define how the galaxy saw them for generations to come. Ambassador Helen Pierce was already at the Galactic Council station when the orders came through. She had been preparing for a routine trade negotiation with the Xanthor Collective. Instead, she found herself standing in the main council chamber demanding immediate action against the Krellian Empire. Representatives from 47 different species listened to her presentation with varying degrees of concern and sympathy. The Krellian ambassador was a tall creature with scales that reflected the chamber's lights. He stood at his position and expressed deep regret for the tragic incident. He claimed that the Severing Talons commander had acted without proper authorization. He suggested that a commission be formed to investigate the circumstances. The process would be thorough and fair, but it would take time, perhaps 6 months or a year, to gather all the evidence and testimony. Helen listened to the carefully crafted political language and felt her anger growing. The other council members offered their condolences and their support for a proper investigation. Some suggested economic sanctions. Others proposed diplomatic censure. All of them recommended patience and following established procedures. None of them suggested actual consequences that would mean anything. She walked out of the chamber without another word. The message she sent back to Earth was brief and direct. The galaxy would not act. The diplomatic channels would produce nothing but delays and empty gestures. If humanity wanted justice for the Nightingale, they would have to take it themselves. Colonel Ryan Murphy stood in the strategic planning room at Pacific Fleet Command, surrounded by displays showing every piece of intelligence Earth had on the Krellian Empire. The information had been gathered over decades through normal diplomatic channels and through less official means. Now that data was being analyzed by the finest military minds humanity could produce, the picture was not encouraging from a conventional standpoint. The Krellian Empire controlled 14 star systems and maintained one of the largest military forces in the galaxy. Their fleet included over 300 capital ships and thousands of smaller vessels. Their technology was roughly equal to Earth's in most areas and superior in some. Their defensive positions were well established and heavily fortified. General Nathan Cross ran the simulations over and over. Every conventional war game showed the same result. A direct military confrontation would be long and bloody. Human forces would likely win eventually, but the cost would be measured in millions of lives and decades of warfare. The Krellians had been fighting wars for over 4,000 years. They knew how to defend their territory, but something had shifted in the room. The officers gathered around the planning table were not discussing whether to respond with military force. They were only discussing how to do it most effectively, because the attack on the Nightingale had triggered something deep in the human psyche. A line had been crossed that could not be ignored or negotiated away. Dr. Paul Grant entered the room carrying a data chip that contained information so classified that only 50 people on Earth knew it existed. He was the director of a program called Prometheus Protocol. Officially, the program did not exist at all. The budget came from accounts buried so deep in the military financial structure that even most generals did not know about them. Paul loaded the data chip into the main display system, and the room went quiet. Ship designs appeared on the screens, weapon systems that pushed the boundaries of what galactic conventions considered acceptable, tactics and strategies that prioritized overwhelming force and rapid victory over any consideration of proportional response. Admiral Blake studied the information carefully. These were not the ships and weapons that Earth showed to the galaxy. These were the tools that humanity had been building in secret facilities beyond Neptune for the last 20 years. Every military power prepared for worst-case scenarios. Earth's worst-case scenario had always been a situation exactly like this one. The question Admiral Blake asked was simple and direct. How quickly could these systems be deployed and made operational? Dr. Paul smiled for the first time since hearing about the Nightingale. 72 hours. Everything they needed was already built and waiting. The ships were fueled and the crews were trained. All they needed was the order to launch. President Webb gave that order at midnight Earth Standard Time. There would be no diplomatic protests filed, no negotiating team sent to meet with Krellian representatives, no waiting for the Galactic Council to complete its investigation. Humanity would deliver its response in the only language that mattered now. Overwhelming and immediate military force. The orders went out through encrypted channels to every human military installation in known space. Fleet commanders opened sealed envelopes that had been prepared years ago for exactly this contingency. Colonial defense forces activated protocols that had been practiced but never used. Research stations powered up weapon systems that had been tested but never fired in anger. Within 6 hours, every human military asset began moving to predetermined positions. Communication with civilian channels was reduced to essential traffic only. The normal chatter of military transmissions went silent. From the outside, it looked like Earth had simply gone dark, like humanity had been frightened into silence by the Krellian show of force. The Krellian Empire monitored the unusual communications patterns with interest. Their intelligence analysts prepared reports suggesting that Earth was preparing for diplomatic negotiations from a position of weakness. Some analysts noted the troop movements and fleet repositioning, but interpreted it as defensive posturing. Earth was clearly afraid of further Krellian military action. The Krellian High Command held a meeting to discuss their next moves. Some generals suggested pressing their advantage while humanity was off balance. Others recommended waiting to see what diplomatic overtures Earth would make. They had 3 days to debate their options and feel confident in their superior position. Admiral Blake stood on the bridge of the UES Vengeance and watched the final preparations being completed. Her ship was one of 37 vessels that would make up the strike force. Every single one had been built using Prometheus protocol specifications. They were not pretty ships. There was no elegant design or aesthetic consideration. They were tools designed for a single purpose, and that purpose was to kill as efficiently as possible. The Krellians had 72 hours to enjoy their sense of superiority. 72 hours to believe that they had successfully intimidated humanity into submission. 72 hours before they learned that attacking a hospital, ship full of unarmed medical personnel was the worst mistake their empire had ever made. The countdown clock on the Vengeance's bridge ticked down steadily. When it reached 0, the Krellian Empire would discover what happened when you made humanity truly angry. They would learn that mercy was a choice humans made, not a weakness they suffered from. And they would understand too late that the quiet before the storm was not fear, but preparation. The Krellian Forward Operating Base at Arcturus 7 was considered the most secure military installation in the entire sector. Admiral Krelzar commanded the 3rd Imperial Fleet from his flagship, stationed at the heart of the defensive grid. 42 capital ships surrounded the base along with hundreds of smaller vessels and defensive platforms that bristled with enough weapons to hold off any conceivable attack. The Admiral stood on his command deck reviewing routine reports and feeling confident in his position. Commander Lucy Bennett brought her stealth ship called Shadowrunner to within 500 kilometers of the outer defensive perimeter. Her vessel was built using technology that humanity had developed quietly over the past decade, but never revealed to the galaxy. Every sensor and detection system in the Arcturus system registered her ship as nothing more than empty space. She deployed her reconnaissance drones and settled in to wait for the signal. At exactly 0400 hours Galactic Standard Time, the attack began. The first indication that something was wrong came when every communications relay in the entire Arcturus system went offline simultaneously. The Krellian technicians assumed it was a technical malfunction and began running diagnostics. They had approximately 6 minutes before they would understand the truth. Those 6 minutes would be the last peaceful moments the 3rd Imperial Fleet would ever experience. The human fleet emerged from quantum slip space at the edge of the system. 37 warships materialized in perfect formation, with the UES Vengeance at the center. Admiral Blake stood on her bridge and watched the tactical displays update with enemy positions. The Krellian ships looked impressive on the sensors with their elegant designs and proud battle honors. In a few minutes, they would be nothing but debris. The human warships looked nothing like the sleek vessels favored by other species. They were blocky and utilitarian, with every available space devoted to weapons or armor. There were no observation decks or comfortable crew quarters. These ships were built by people who understood that war was not glorious or beautiful. War was about killing the enemy before they could kill you. Lieutenant Kevin Barnes sat at the tactical station on the Vengeance and armed the primary weapon systems. His fingers moved across controls that would have been familiar to any naval officer from Earth's past. Humanity had not abandoned centuries of naval warfare experience when they reached the stars. They had simply adapted those lessons to a larger battlefield. The first wave consisted of railgun rounds launched from every ship in the human fleet simultaneously. The projectiles were simple pieces of metal accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed. No shields in the galaxy could stop that much kinetic energy delivered that precisely. The outer defensive platforms simply ceased to exist. One moment they were there, and the next moment they were expanding clouds of vapor and debris. Admiral Krelzar felt his command deck shudder and looked at his displays in confusion. 6 defensive platforms had just disappeared from the tactical map. Before he could process what that meant, 12 more vanished. He started shouting orders to get his fleet into defensive formation, but the human attack plan did not allow time for responses. The second wave hit before the Krellians could react. Missile pods deployed from the human warships, and each pod released thousands of smart munitions. The Krellian point defense systems were designed to handle normal missile attacks. They were not designed to handle this. Thousands of missiles moving in coordinated patterns overwhelmed every defensive system. The missiles did not even need direct hits. They detonated in proximity and released clouds of tiny fragments that shredded hull plating and armor. Captain Amy Rodriguez commanded the destroyer UES Retribution, and her specialty was electronic warfare. While the rest of the fleet engaged in direct combat, her crew launched cyber attacks that bypassed every security protocol the Krellians had. Life support systems began failing on Krellian ships. Weapons targeting went offline. Navigation systems started giving false readings. Engines shut down without warning. Admiral Krelzar watched his fleet die around him and could not understand how this was happening. The humans were supposed to be a young species with limited military experience. They should not have weapons like this. They should not have tactics like this. His flagship shuddered as railgun rounds tore through the armor, and his screens went dark as the retributions. Cyber attacks corrupted his systems. The battle lasted exactly 17 minutes from first shot to final kill. The Third Imperial Fleet, which had been the pride of the Krellian military for 2 centuries, was reduced to wreckage. 42 capital ships destroyed. Hundreds of smaller vessels turned into debris. Thousands of Krellian warriors dead. Admiral Blake allowed exactly 3 ships to escape with their crews intact and their sensor logs complete. She wanted witnesses. She wanted everyone to know what happened when you attacked human medical personnel. But Arcturus 7 was not the only target. At the same moment, human strike forces hit 9 other Krellian military installations across the sector. Every forward operating base, every supply depot, every staging area. The attacks were coordinated with a precision that terrified every military analyst in the galaxy who studied the recordings later. Colonel Stephen Walsh led a Marine assault on the Krellian garrison at Helios Station. His troops wore powered armor that made them faster and stronger than any Krellian soldier. They moved through the station corridors like ghosts. Their weapons were designed not just for lethality, but for psychological impact. The sound alone was enough to break enemy morale before the fighting even started. The Marines did not take prisoners during the initial assault. They swept through the station with ruthless efficiency and eliminated every armed defender they encountered. When the fighting was over, they left exactly 1 survivor with a message. Go back to your empire. Tell them what happened here. Tell them this is only the beginning. Tell them that humanity has not even started to show what they are truly capable of. Within 18 hours, the Krellian military presence in the entire sector had been effectively eliminated. Humanity had demonstrated capabilities that shocked even their closest allies. The ferocity and coordination and absolute ruthlessness of the assault left the galaxy stunned. Species that had considered humans to be peaceful and diplomatic were forced to reevaluate everything they thought they knew. But Admiral Blake was not finished. The Krellians needed to understand that humanity's response would not be proportional. Earth was not interested in measured retaliation or limited strikes. The attack on the Nightingale demanded an absolute response. The Krellian Empire needed to learn that there were consequences for their actions that went beyond anything they could imagine. The human fleet regrouped at a staging area just outside Krellian-controlled space. Reinforcements arrived from Earth, bringing the total force to over 60 warships. Supply vessels loaded with enough ammunition and fuel to sustain operations for months. Medical ships arrived to treat human casualties, though there had been remarkably few. The entire operation had been planned and executed with a level of professionalism that came from decades of preparation. Admiral Blake sent a message to Earth. Command requesting permission for Phase 2 of the operation. President Webb's response came back within an hour. Permission granted. Take the fight to their homeworld. Show them that nowhere is safe. Make them understand that attacking humans carries a price that will be paid in full. The fleet began moving deeper into Krellian space. They did not target civilian populations or colonies. Every strike hit military infrastructure exclusively. Supply depots burned. Shipyards were reduced to rubble. Training facilities were destroyed. But the message was clear to anyone paying attention. Humanity could reach anywhere they wanted. The Krellians could not stop them. General Linda Foster commanded the UES Judgment, which was a carrier vessel designed around a single devastating weapon system. The crew called it the Hammer of Dawn, and it had never been used in actual combat. General Foster positioned her ship in orbit above the Krellian homeworld itself. She matched orbit directly over the Imperial Palace. The Emperor could look up at his sky and see the human vessel hanging there like a promise of destruction. The Krellian High Command held emergency meetings and tried to formulate a response. But what response could they make? Their forward fleets were destroyed. Their defensive positions were in ruins, and now human warships were orbiting their homeworld with weapons that could turn cities into glass. The proud Krellian Empire had been brought to its knees in less than 3 days. The first reports reached the Krellian homeworld with news that seemed impossible to believe. Entire fleets destroyed in minutes, military bases reduced to rubble, forward positions overrun by human forces that fought with a brutality that defied everything the Krellians thought they knew about this young species. The Emperor's advisors insisted the reports must be exaggerated. Warriors fleeing combat always made their defeat sound worse than they actually were. Then the survivors started arriving. Ships limping into port with crews that had witnessed things they could barely describe. Officers who had commanded proud vessels now spoke in whispers about weapons that came from nowhere, and tactics that gave no chance for honorable combat. The medical facilities on the homeworld began filling with wounded warriors, who stared at nothing and flinched at sudden sounds. The Emperor convened his war council in the grand chamber beneath the palace. Military leaders from across the empire gathered to discuss the crisis. They studied the sensor recordings from the few ships that escaped. They watched the human fleet tear through defensive positions that should have held for weeks. They saw their proud warships die without landing a single effective hit against the enemy. Admiral Blake's fleet settled into position around the Krellian homeworld and began broadcasting on all frequencies. Every species in the galaxy could listen in and hear what humanity had to say. Blake's voice was calm and measured. She did not sound angry or emotional. She sounded like someone explaining simple facts that everyone needed to understand. She started by playing the footage from the Nightingale attack. The galaxy watched as the hospital ship burned. They saw the escape pods being hunted down one by one. They heard the final transmissions from people who knew they were about to die. Blake let the footage speak for itself without adding commentary. The images were powerful enough on their own. Then Blake began reading names. She read slowly and clearly. Dr. Lisa Monroe, who had been performing surgery on a child when she died. Captain Daniel Hayes, who had commanded the Nightingale with honor for 3 years. Nurse Emma Sullivan, who survived only by chance. Blake read every single name of the 2,247 people who had died. It took nearly an hour. When she finished reading the names, Blake explained humanity's position. Medical personnel were sacred. Hospital ships were protected. These were not suggestions or diplomatic niceties. These were absolute laws that humanity would enforce with whatever force was necessary. The Krellian Empire had violated those laws, and now they would pay the price. Ambassador Carl Lewis arrived at the Krellian homeworld carrying Earth's terms. He met with the Emperor's diplomatic staff in a meeting room that had hosted negotiations for thousands of years. The Krellians expected the usual diplomatic dance. Offers and counteroffers, compromises and agreements. Instead, Carl laid out Earth's demands and made it clear there would be no negotiation. The Krellian Empire would surrender every officer involved in the attack on the Nightingale. They would pay reparations to the families of every victim. They would formally acknowledge their crime before the Galactic Council. And they would sign a treaty, recognizing the protected status of all medical vessels with enforcement provided by human military power. These terms were not negotiable. The Krellians could accept them or they could face complete destruction. The Emperor refused. His pride would not allow him to surrender his officers to human justice. His advisors told him that accepting these terms would be seen as weakness by every rival power in the galaxy. The Krellian Empire had existed for over 4,000 years. They would not bow to a species that had barely left their homeworld a century ago. Admiral Blake gave the Emperor 24 hours to reconsider his position. When those hours passed with no change, she began the blockade. Human ships moved to surround the Krellian homeworld and every major colony. No vessels were allowed in or out, no trade. No communications beyond system boundaries. No exceptions for any reason. The economic impact was immediate and devastating. The Krellian economy depended on interstellar commerce. Raw materials came from mining colonies. Food came from agricultural worlds. Manufacturing took place across dozens of facilities spread throughout the empire. When the blockade cut off all movement between systems, the entire economic structure began collapsing. Within 3 days, food shortages started appearing on the homeworld. Within a week, factories were shutting down for lack of materials. Within 2 weeks, the civilian population was openly protesting in the streets. They wanted to know why their government had attacked a hospital ship. They wanted to know why their leaders were willing to let the empire starve rather than accept responsibility for a crime. Commander Peter Harrison ran the Psychological Operations Division for Earth's military intelligence. His team worked around the clock, broadcasting footage of the Nightingale attack to every corner of Krellian space. They made sure every citizen knew exactly what their military had done. They showed the hospital ship burning. They showed escape pods being destroyed. They made it impossible for anyone to pretend this had been a legitimate military action. The public opinion shifted rapidly. The war had been sold to the Krellian people as a defensive necessity. Earth was expanding too aggressively and needed to be checked. But the reality shown in the footage was something completely different. This was not defense. This was murder of unarmed healers. Even the most patriotic Krellians began questioning their government's choices. General Nathan Cross met with senior Krellian military officers in a neutral location. The meeting was unofficial and secret. Cross brought with him classified files on human military capabilities. He showed them the weapons and ships that Earth had deployed so far. Then he showed them the weapons and ships that were still in development. The systems they had faced were first-generation technology. Earth had been building more advanced designs for years. The Krellian generals studied the information in silence. They were warriors who had trained for combat their entire lives. They understood tactical realities. The simulations Cross showed them all ended the same way. If the Krellians wanted to continue this conflict, humanity would escalate. And escalation would end with the complete destruction of the Krellian Empire. It was not a threat. It was mathematics. Cold hard numbers that showed exactly how many ships humanity could build and how long the Krellian military could survive against them. The answer was not long enough. The Krellian generals had led their people into a war they could not win against an enemy they had completely misunderstood. The Emperor received a private communication from Admiral Blake. She explained that humanity did not want the destruction of the Krellian people. Earth had no interest in conquering their worlds or enslaving their population. What humanity wanted was justice for the Nightingale. They wanted assurance it would never happen again. And they wanted the galaxy to understand that attacking human medical personnel carried consequences beyond imagination. The Emperor sat in his private chambers and looked at the tactical displays. Human warships orbited every major world in his empire. His economy was collapsing. His people were suffering. His military could not win. He thought about his legacy and what future generations would say about his reign. He thought about the pride of his people and the survival of their culture. Then he made the decision that would define the rest of Krellian history. He contacted Admiral Blake and agreed to Earth's terms. Every single one without modification or negotiation. He would surrender the officers responsible. He would pay the reparations. He would acknowledge the crime. And he would sign the treaty that gave humanity enforcement power over medical vessel protection throughout the galaxy. The announcement sent shockwaves through every government in known space. The Krellian Empire was one of the oldest and most powerful civilizations in the galaxy. They had just surrendered unconditionally to a species that most considered newcomers to galactic affairs. The balance of power had shifted in ways that nobody fully understood yet. But everyone knew that humanity had just announced themselves as a force that could not be ignored. The formal ceremony took place on the Galactic Council Station, with representatives from every major species in attendance. The Krellian Emperor stood in the center of the chamber, surrounded by his generals and the officers who had commanded the attack on the Nightingale. Admiral Blake stood opposite with Emma Sullivan and the other 6 survivors beside her. The galaxy watched through live broadcasts as one of the oldest empires humbled itself before humanity. The Emperor read the confession in his own language first. His voice was steady, but everyone could hear the weight of shame behind the words. He described the attack on the hospital ship. He acknowledged that it was a deliberate act targeting medical personnel who could not defend themselves. He accepted full responsibility for the crime. Then he repeated the confession in galactic standards so that every species could understand. Finally, he read it in English so that Earth would hear the words directly. The officers who had commanded the attack were led forward in restraints. They had been stripped of their ranks and honors. Their names would be erased from all official Krellian records. They would be remembered only as examples of what happened when warriors forgot the basic rules of civilized warfare. Captain Karen Phillips led the human prosecution team and presented evidence that left no room for doubt or appeal. The trial was conducted according to both human and galactic law. Every species acknowledged that the process was fair. The sentences were harsh but legal. The Krellian commanders would spend the rest of their lives in prison facilities designed specifically for war criminals. They would never see their homeworld again. They would never speak to their families again. They would live out their years knowing that their actions had brought their entire empire to its knees, but the officers were only symbols. The real consequence was the treaty that followed. The Nightingale Accords changed the fundamental rules of galactic warfare. Medical vessels were granted absolute protection under human military enforcement. Any species that violated the treaty would face immediate intervention. No warnings, no negotiations, just swift and overwhelming response. President Webb addressed the Galactic Council directly through a live transmission from Earth. He explained that humanity had not sought this role. They had not wanted to become the galaxy's enforcers, but the attack on the Nightingale had demonstrated something important. Without enforcement, principles were just words. Treaties without consequences were meaningless. Earth would maintain whatever military presence was necessary to protect medical personnel, everywhere and always. The response from the galaxy was mixed and complicated. Some species applauded human resolve and immediately signed the accords. Others feared this new power dynamic and worried about what it meant for galactic politics. But nobody questioned whether humanity would follow through on their promises. The wreckage of the Krellian Third Fleet still drifted in space as a permanent reminder of what happened when you attacked human medical personnel. Several smaller conflicts across the galaxy ended within weeks of the accords being signed. Factions that had been fighting for years suddenly found themselves facing a new reality. If they harmed medical personnel, humanity would intervene. And humanity had just demonstrated that their intervention was absolute and merciless. Warlords who had ignored galactic law for decades suddenly started respecting medical neutrality. Admiral Blake retired 6 months after the treaty signing. She had done what needed to be done, but the weight of it sat heavy on her shoulders. At her retirement ceremony, she spoke about the 2,247 people who died on the Nightingale. She spoke about Dr. Lisa Monroe, who had been saving a child's life when the attack came. She spoke about Captain Daniel Hayes, who had dedicated his career to helping others. She explained that their deaths had purchased something precious. Future medical personnel could now work without fear of deliberate attack. Emma Sullivan returned to medical service on the new UHMS Nightingale II. The hospital ship was built to the same specifications as the original, but with one significant difference. It was permanently escorted by 3 destroyers that carried enough firepower to flatten a small moon. Emma treated patients of every species, including Krellians who came seeking help after their empire's economy had collapsed. The first time a Krellian patient came aboard, Emma felt her hands shake slightly. She remembered the attack. She remembered watching her friends die. But she also remembered why she had chosen this profession. She treated the Krellian with the same care and attention she gave every patient. That was what it meant to be a healer. That was what the people on the original Nightingale had died protecting. The Krellian Empire survived but was forever changed. The younger generation especially understood that their old warrior culture had led them to disaster. They began embracing different values. Education became more important than military service. Diplomacy became more respected than conquest. Some historians would later argue that humanity's brutal response had actually saved the Krellians from destroying themselves through their own aggression. Commander Lucy Bennett continued flying stealth missions across the galaxy. Her purpose now was different, though. She protected medical convoys. She investigated distress calls from hospital ships. She made sure that the Nightingale Accords were respected in every corner of known space. Rumors spread about her ship and her crew. They called her the Ghost. Nobody attacked medical vessels in her patrol zones. Nobody even thought about it. Dr. Paul Grant's Prometheus protocol remained classified, but whispers spread through galactic intelligence networks. Humanity had weapon systems that even allied species did not fully understand. Some rumors suggested capabilities that made the Arcturus assault look primitive. Whether the rumors were true or exaggerated did not really matter. The uncertainty served Earth's purposes perfectly. Nobody wanted to test humanity's limits. 10 years after the attack, a memorial was built on Earth. It stood in Geneva near the old United Nations complex. A simple white wall listed every name of everyone who died on the Nightingale. At the top was carved a phrase in multiple languages. They came to heal, and we came to ensure no one would harm them again. The memorial became a place of pilgrimage for medical professionals from across the galaxy. The galactic community learned many lessons from the Nightingale incident. They learned that humanity possessed military capabilities far beyond what anyone had suspected. They learned that human emotions, particularly anger and grief, could drive strategic decisions in ways that more logical species found difficult to predict. They learned that attacking the helpless was the surest way to awaken something dangerous in the human character. But the most important lesson was simpler than all of that. Humanity meant what they said. When Earth declared something sacred, they would enforce that declaration with every resource at their disposal. Medical personnel were safe now. Hospital ships were protected. The ruins of Krellian military bases stood as eternal warnings across the galaxy. Harm the healers and face consequences that would shake the stars themselves. The UHMS Nightingale continued its mission through the years. Dr. Sophie Martinez commanded the medical staff and carried on the tradition of those who came before. She traveled to war zones and disaster areas. She treated everyone who needed help regardless of species or circumstances, and she did this knowing that humanity's military stood ready to protect her and every other medical worker in the galaxy. The stars themselves had learned to respect the symbol of human medicine. The red cross on a white background now carried weight that went beyond simple recognition. It carried the promise of help for those who needed it, and it carried the promise of vengeance for anyone foolish enough to attack it. The galaxy had changed. The rules were different now, and humanity had written those new rules in fire and steel to ensure that 2,247 souls had not died in vain.